My honor and privilege to introduce our guest speaker today. He is a distinguished family physician and educator who has dedicated nearly 3 decades to both the medical and law enforcement communities. As a police surgeon with the NYPD, he assisted victims at Ground Zero and continues to support those affected by the events of 9/11, addressing long-term health issues and overseeing new cases. He was recently promoted to Deputy Chief Surgeon, overseeing care of more than 1,500 officers, and his humanitarian work has earned him numerous accolades. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce Dr. Brian J. Mignola. Brian? Thank you.
No pressure. Good afternoon, thank you for having me. It was a day very much like today. The weather was perfect, and I remember thinking as I got in the car to go to do hospital rounds, how beautiful the day was until the first radio transmission. Still thinking it was an accident, but realizing that would probably be tied up for most of the day, if not several days. My wife, who was at that time the nurse manager of the burn unit at the hospital, that we would both be tied up. My first instinct was to run to my kids' school, get them, drop them off with my mother-in-law, so we can work with a clear head, because we didn't know what was the duration going to be. Second plane hit, and then we knew. Got to the hospital, and just touching base with my wife, the vice president of the hospital came around the corner. He said, "I need you in the emergency room, not down at Ground Zero," at that point. And it made sense. My partner in private practice was the chief medical officer for the fire department, so I knew where she was. So in the ER, we got ready. We emptied out the hospital in approximately a half hour, 90% of the patients in anticipation of receiving all this trauma. At that point, Coast Guard pulled up and said, well, by car, we'll be bringing victims over to the Navy home port on the North Shore of Staten Island, direct view of the Trade Center. So they dispatched me and a trauma nurse to set up a triage. When we got there, the first building was down, and it was a bunch of detectives that I was friendly with in uniform. We all were preparing to receive those victims. Looking up, and the military planes flying overhead, the second tower went down. The detective standing next to me, without missing a beat, said, well, my son-in-law was on the 103rd floor. He had told him to go up there to be airlifted. And just within a heartbeat went back into first responder mode, became a detective, and did what he had to do to help us get ready for the receiving of the victims. None of them ever came, and we waited, no victims. At one point, we decided to go back to the hospital. And when we got back there, the rumor was that the terrorists were going to be attacking the emergency rooms. And a robocall went out, which I received days later when we got home on the answering machine, for all off-duty and retired members of the service to respond to the closest ER or closest command. So I'm in the ambulance bay, and we're waiting, and we're waiting, and we're waiting. No victims. This gentleman, who had to be at that time in his mid to late 70s, starts walking up to the ER, to the ambulance bay, retired police officer, with his tube shield hanging out, a strap across his chest, his .38, and a little bit hunched over, went to the ambulance bay, stood at attention, and he protected us. That feeling of we all were coming together at that point. I actually felt a sign of relief that he was there watching out for us. And we waited, and we waited. No victims. Now, fast forward up. We were all in the hospital. I think it was about midnight. The skies were clear. One helicopter flew over, and these little things that stay in your mind. And we all got startled for a moment, but they kept on flying. NYPD brought one of the uniform officers to Staten Island Hospital with a fractured ankle. And then the walking wounded started coming in full of dust and coughing and things like that, but no critical victims at that point. We didn't know at that time, but they were all gone. Fast forward now, I was asked to go up to the landfill on Staten Island because they were bringing the debris over there. We were sorting through it by hand. And it was something out of a sci-fi movie. The plateau, which was lit up with floodlights in the middle of the night, the dust from the landfill with methane gas popping up, the officers in these white suits with masks and goggles by hand going through material. And I'm saying to myself, how surreal is this? And these officers are living in an environment that was hostile to our health, but they were doing their job. And I was responsible. They were bringing wheelbarrows over with human remains, which I couldn't figure out what they were because it was such a bad thing. The other things that stay in my mind, police officer's shield, police officer's service weapon in a barrel, a wallet that when we opened up for identification, a perfect Amex card, believe it of all things. But that sticks in your mind. The bottles of water that our officers were drinking full of dust. The food that they were eating at the landfill site, full of dust. And it just leaves this impression. But at the tragedy of all this and of the evil that we've experienced with that, the feeling of how proud I was of being part of something to help, how proud I was of my fellow members of the NYPD and FDNY out there doing what they needed to do. Fast forward again, now the fallout that we had after the incident. And what I mean by that, I remember being in the NYPD medical clinic when we had an officer come in, Maddie, coughing and coughing. Maddie, you should go get seen by your private doc. We were responsible for keeping her out, line of duty and sick and everything. And she refused. She said nothing could be that bad, but Maddie, please go. 6 weeks later, Maddie was gone. Left her child behind. Another officer who was in the housing bureau, first day he was getting assigned to a local precinct, walks into my office, my private office. His wife was my patient. He was flushed. He was short of breath. He lightheaded. We transported him to the hospital. He had a huge left lung mass with metastasis to the brain. He was gone within weeks. Good friend of mine, a chief of the NYPD, who was in the landfill and down in Ground Zero. He was actually trapped in a basement for a while. Came into my office one day, short of breath, little rapid heart rate. Sent him to the hospital. Long story short, leukemia, 9/11 related. He did not make it. Another friend of mine, another chief, comes in. I have pain on my left side of my chest. Said, you know what, you were down here, let's do a mammography. Sure enough, breast cancer. Thank God he survived. We got it in time. But those impressions that last with you, to this day, I'm still dealing, both professionally with my private office and with the NYPD, members of the service who've developed cancers and chronic conditions. They'll never be the same. Those images are so embedded in my memory. It's like a Polaroid of those, you know, that reference in my head. But the evil that we saw and the hostility we saw that day, and on the flip, the humanity of everybody stepping up, civilians, firemen, cops, EMS, and I remember bringing supplies over to the local firehouses and to the local stations to get to the people in the landfill that were doing their thing, clothes, water, food. Just everybody came together and stepped up. And that made me proud to be part of this. And to this day, we can't forget that. We have to remember those who were victims, remember their memory, honor those who served. And if we do forget, we may find ourselves in a situation similar down the road. We have to stay vigilant. On that note, thank you again for having me. I hate to be the down person of this thing, a little bit of a down thing, but it has to be embedded in our memories, and we have to move on. Thank you.